The most persistent misconception surrounding the Annabelle case is that it represents a beginning. It does not. Investigators who approached the case early understood something that popular narratives rarely address. Annabelle was not the first instance of this kind of phenomenon. She was a continuation, a visible point in a pattern that had already been observed elsewhere, under different names, objects, and circumstances. What made Annabelle notable was not originality, but clarity. Her case arrived with enough documentation, consistency, and duration to expose a structure that had previously gone unnoticed. Long before Annabelle entered public awareness, investigators had recorded similar profiles. Objects associated with familiarity rather than fear. Environments that shifted psychologically before any physical anomaly appeared. Effects that correlated with attention rather than belief. These cases were often dismissed individually because they lacked spectacle. They did not escalate quickly enough to demand action. Without a reference point, they appeared isolated. Annabelle changed that. She provided a model against which earlier cases could be re-examined. Patterns that once seemed coincidental suddenly aligned. One of the earliest realizations was that the object itself rarely mattered. In several pre-Annabelle cases, the focal point had been different. A piece of furniture, a personal belonging, a decorative item with no inherent symbolism. What these objects shared was not history or material, but role. They occupied trusted spaces. They blended into daily routines. They invited normalization. Annabelle fit this profile perfectly. Her appearance disarmed instinctive caution. She did not signal danger. She signaled familiarity. Investigators recognized this as a consistent entry condition across cases. Another shared feature was delay. In nearly every comparable case, the initial period after introduction was uneventful. Days or weeks passed without incident. This delay created a false baseline. When subtle changes finally emerged, they were measured against a memory of normality that no longer existed. Investigators noted that this delay served a functional purpose. It allowed the object to integrate into routine before attention sharpened. By the time attention arrived, conditions had already shifted. Investigators reviewing older cases noticed that escalation, when it occurred, followed a similar sequence. First came minor anomalies easily rationalized. Then came environmental discomfort without clear cause. Only later did physical effects appear. This progression mirrored the Annabelle timeline precisely. The similarity was too exact to ignore. Annabelle did not introduce a new pattern. She confirmed an existing one. This realization reframed how investigators interpreted early failures. Many earlier cases had been closed prematurely because escalation stopped. At the time, this cessation was interpreted as resolution. In light of the Annabelle model, investigators reconsidered those conclusions. Stability did not necessarily mean elimination. It could mean equilibrium. The same equilibrium later observed in the Annabelle case. The difference was that Annabelle remained under observation long enough for equilibrium to be recognized as a state rather than an ending. The phrase "Annabelle was never the first" also reflects a deeper shift in investigative philosophy. Prior to her case, anomalies were often treated as isolated events. Each was evaluated independently. Annabelle demonstrated the risk of this approach. Patterns only emerge across cases, not within them. Once investigators began comparing timelines, behaviors, and responses, similarities became impossible to dismiss. What had seemed rare was simply interconnected. Another important insight emerged regarding human response. In earlier cases, investigators often focused on the object or environment. Annabelle redirected focus toward behavior, how people interacted, how attention fluctuated, how interpretation altered response. When these variables were mapped across multiple cases, they aligned consistently. Objects became secondary. Interaction became primary. Annabelle's case provided the clarity needed to prioritize this shift. This shift also exposed a limitation in traditional investigation. Seeking causes in isolation obscured systemic influence. Annabelle illustrated that influence could be distributed rather than localized. Removing an object did not necessarily remove effect. It altered conditions, but behavior determined outcome. This insight retroactively explained why earlier cases reappeared years later under different circumstances. The pattern had not ended. It had relocated. Investigators began to suspect that what they were observing was not a series of unique phenomena, but a recurring mechanism. A mechanism that relied on predictable human tendencies: curiosity, normalization, dismissal, and delayed response. Annabelle did not create this mechanism. She exemplified it. Her case persisted long enough and was documented carefully enough to make the mechanism visible. This recognition fundamentally altered how new cases were evaluated. Investigators stopped asking whether something was unprecedented. They asked whether it matched an existing profile. Annabelle became the reference point for that profile, not because she was the most extreme example, but because she was the most instructive. She revealed the underlying structure by remaining consistent over time. The realization that Annabelle was not the first also carried an unsettling implication. She would not be the last. If the mechanism predated her case, it could reappear under different forms, different objects, different environments, different contexts. The challenge for investigators was no longer identification, but recognition. How to spot the pattern early enough to prevent escalation without relying on spectacle. This is where the first phase of this story truly begins. Not with Annabelle's arrival, but with the moment investigators understood that her case was part of something larger. A pattern that had existed quietly, unresolved, and often unnoticed. Annabelle did not introduce a threat. She revealed one. Understanding this reframes everything that follows. The case is no longer about a single object or location. It is about continuity, about repetition, about mechanisms that persist across time and context. Annabelle stands at the center of this narrative not as an origin, but as evidence. Evidence that something had been happening long before anyone thought to connect the dots. This first part establishes the foundation for that broader understanding. The next phase will examine how investigators traced these earlier cases backward, what they discovered when they compared timelines, and why recognizing that Annabelle was never the first changed how every subsequent case was handled. Once investigators accepted that Annabelle was not an isolated case, their work changed direction. Instead of moving forward in search of escalation, they moved backward in search of precedent. Old files were reopened. Reports that had once seemed inconclusive were re-examined with a new lens. What they found was not a single origin point, but a trail of partial matches, cases that shared structure without sharing surface detail. Different objects, different locations, different people. The same progression: delay, normalization, engagement, and eventual destabilization. Annabelle did not stand alone. She fit. One of the most striking discoveries during this retrospective analysis was how often earlier cases had been closed for the same reason: inactivity. Investigators had interpreted silence as resolution. Without dramatic manifestation, there was no justification to keep cases open. Annabelle challenged that logic. Her case demonstrated that inactivity could represent equilibrium rather than absence. When earlier cases were reevaluated under this assumption, many no longer appeared resolved. They appeared paused. The difference was subtle, but profound. In several pre-Annabelle cases, investigators noted periods of calm lasting years. Families moved on. Objects were discarded or relocated. Documentation ended. Yet similar disturbances later emerged in new environments connected to the same individuals. At the time, these were treated as separate incidents. After Annabelle, investigators recognized a continuity that had been missed. The phenomenon had not ended. It had followed behavior. The pattern was mobile, not fixed. This realization reframed causality entirely. Another common thread involved misattribution. Earlier cases were often explained through psychological stress, environmental factors, or coincidence because no single explanation fully fit. Each explanation addressed part of the experience but not the whole. Annabelle's case did not eliminate these explanations. It contextualized them. Psychological stress did not cause the phenomenon. It interacted with it. Environmental discomfort was not the source. It was an effect. Coincidence did not explain repetition. Pattern did. Investigators also observed that many earlier cases shared a critical vulnerability: compassion-based engagement. Objects were often associated with personal meaning, inheritance, memory, sentiment. This emotional framing lowered defenses. In Annabelle's case, the narrative of innocence served the same function. Compassion encouraged permission. Permission altered conditions. When earlier cases were revisited, similar moments appeared repeatedly. A decision made out of kindness, an assumption of harmlessness. A boundary relaxed. Each time, escalation followed later, not immediately. The backward tracing also revealed a consistent failure point in investigation methodology. Early investigators focused on events rather than intervals. They documented what happened, but not how long nothing happened. Annabelle highlighted the importance of those intervals. Delay was not incidental, it was functional. The longer a system remained calm, the more confidently it was treated as safe. This confidence invited engagement. Engagement created opportunity. By overlooking intervals, investigators had missed the most predictive variable. As files were cross-referenced, timelines began to align in unsettling ways. The same duration between introduction and first anomaly. The same gap between normalization and escalation. The same pattern of dismissal followed by concern. These alignments were not exact, but they were close enough to suggest structure rather than chance. Annabelle's case provided the temporal clarity needed to see these similarities. Without her long, uninterrupted documentation, the pattern would have remained fragmented. Another revelation involved investigator behavior itself. In earlier cases, escalation often followed renewed attention. When investigators returned after long absences, activity increased. At the time, this was interpreted as coincidence or psychological suggestion. Annabelle reframed it as interaction. Attention functioned as a variable. Returning to a case altered conditions. This insight forced uncomfortable reflection. Investigators were not neutral observers. They were participants, whether they intended to be or not. This realization prompted a shift in protocol. New cases that matched the Annabelle profile were no longer subjected to repeated probing. Observation became passive. Documentation replaced experimentation. The goal shifted from explanation to stabilization. This approach reduced escalation in multiple subsequent cases, reinforcing the idea that the pattern predated Annabelle but could be managed once recognized. Annabelle was not the first, but she was the first to be handled correctly. The backward analysis also exposed how cultural context had obscured earlier patterns. In different eras, similar phenomena were framed differently, sometimes religiously, sometimes psychologically, sometimes socially. These frames changed interpretation, but not behavior. The underlying mechanism persisted regardless of explanation. Annabelle's case cut through these frames by focusing on response rather than belief. Belief varied, response repeated. That repetition was the constant. Investigators began to describe this phenomenon not as an entity-specific case, but as a behavioral system. Objects served as anchors. Environment served as amplifiers. Human attention served as fuel. This system did not require intent in the human sense. It required only predictability. Humans provided that predictability consistently. Annabelle did not introduce the system. She revealed its components. This shift had practical consequences. Investigators stopped searching for a first case entirely. The idea of an origin lost relevance. If the mechanism functioned across time and context, pinpointing a beginning was less useful than identifying conditions. Annabelle's significance lay in conditions, not chronology. She showed what to watch for, not where it started. Understanding that Annabelle was never the first also removed the illusion of containment as an endpoint. If the pattern existed before her, it could exist after her. Containment was not a solution, it was a strategy, a way to interrupt continuity without assuming elimination. This perspective reduced urgency without reducing seriousness. It acknowledged limits without surrendering control. By the end of this phase, investigators no longer spoke of Annabelle as an anomaly. They spoke of her as a reference, a case that clarified how something recurring had been misread for decades. The fear surrounding her shifted accordingly. It was no longer fear of a singular object. It was fear of recurrence through misrecognition. This understanding set the stage for a broader, more unsettling question. If Annabelle was never the first, how many similar cases had been missed entirely because they never escalated far enough to be documented? The answer was unknowable, and that uncertainty became its own source of caution. The second part of this story establishes that Annabelle's importance lies in hindsight. She illuminated a pattern that had always been present but rarely connected. The next phase will explore how this recognition changed forward-looking investigation, how new cases were identified earlier, why escalation was sometimes prevented entirely, and what that implies about how many stories never reached public awareness because intervention happened before spectacle. Once the pattern became visible in hindsight, investigators began applying it prospectively. This marked a decisive change in how new cases were identified and handled. Instead of waiting for escalation, they looked for early structural indicators: prolonged periods of calm after introduction, subtle environmental discomfort without clear cause, and gradual shifts in behavior centered around a single object or space. These indicators had been present in earlier cases, but were ignored because they lacked urgency. Annabelle reframed urgency itself. Escalation was no longer the trigger for intervention. Recognition was. This forward-looking approach produced results that were both reassuring and unsettling. In several instances, intervention occurred before any dramatic event took place. Objects were isolated early. Interaction was reduced deliberately. Documentation emphasized disengagement rather than inquiry. In these cases, escalation never occurred. From the outside, nothing happened. To the individuals involved, this absence of incident felt anticlimactic. To investigators, it confirmed the model. The pattern could be interrupted if recognized early enough. Annabelle had not been unique because of what she did, but because she had been allowed to persist long enough to reveal the mechanism. However, this success introduced a new problem: invisibility. Cases that never escalated never became stories. There were no incidents to report, no narratives to share, no public record of danger avoided. These cases disappeared into administrative silence. Investigators understood that the absence of spectacle did not mean absence of risk. It meant risk had been managed quietly. This realization altered how they evaluated historical data. How many cases had followed the same trajectory but ended early, leaving no trace? The answer could not be quantified. That uncertainty reinforced caution. Another consequence of early recognition was a shift in how responsibility was assigned. In older cases, responsibility emerged after escalation. Someone responded because something happened. In newer cases, responsibility existed preemptively. Someone had to act on pattern recognition alone, without confirmation. This demanded confidence in judgment without proof. Investigators were trained to act conservatively, but acting without visible cause carries its own risk. It invites doubt, challenge, and reinterpretation. Annabelle's case provided the justification needed to sustain such decisions internally. It demonstrated that waiting for proof could itself be dangerous. This approach also required restraint in documentation. Investigators avoided framing early interventions as victories. They documented them as interruptions. Language mattered. Declaring success would invite replication. Replication would require engagement. Engagement was the variable to be minimized. Instead, records focused on what had been prevented rather than what had occurred. This negative space, what did not happen, became as important as any event log. Annabelle had taught them to value absence as outcome. The recognition that Annabelle was never the first also forced investigators to reconsider how they communicated risk. Public warnings rely on examples. Examples rely on escalation. If escalation is prevented, examples disappear. This creates a paradox. The better the system works, the harder it is to justify publicly. Investigators accepted that some knowledge would remain internal. The goal was not to convince an audience. It was to maintain safety. Annabelle's case provided the internal credibility needed to accept this trade-off. Another forward-looking change involved categorization. Investigators stopped grouping cases by object type or reported entity. Instead, they categorized by interaction profile: how much attention was drawn, how quickly normalization occurred, how delay functioned. This behavioral taxonomy proved more predictive than traditional labels. Annabelle became the archetype for this category, not because of her fame, but because of her clarity. She illustrated how a system could persist across contexts without relying on specific symbolism. This shift also altered how investigators evaluated risk tolerance. In earlier eras, risk was tolerated until escalation justified intervention. After Annabelle, tolerance thresholds were lowered. Early signs that matched the profile were sufficient to justify containment measures. Critics might interpret this as overcautious. Investigators interpreted it as learned restraint. The cost of early intervention was minimal. The cost of delayed recognition had already been demonstrated. Over time, this approach reduced the number of high-profile cases dramatically. Escalations became rarer. When they did occur, they were often linked to failures of recognition rather than absence of pattern. This reinforced the conclusion that the mechanism Annabelle revealed was neither rare nor inevitable. It was conditional. Conditions could be altered. Annabelle's tragedy was not that she existed, but that she was allowed to persist unchecked long enough to become instructive. This forward application also reshaped how investigators viewed their own role. They were no longer seekers of explanation. They were managers of conditions. This role demanded humility. It required accepting that not all knowledge should be pursued. Annabelle had demonstrated that pursuit itself could be destabilizing. Investigators learned to prioritize outcome over understanding, stability over narrative. This inversion challenged traditional investigative identity, but it proved effective. The realization that Annabelle was never the first thus transformed fear into foresight. Fear no longer centered on a single object. It centered on the possibility of missing early indicators. Investigators feared oversight more than anomaly. This fear sharpened attention to subtlety. It encouraged patience rather than urgency. In this way, Annabelle's case continued to influence practice long after active management ended. By this stage, the story had expanded beyond Annabelle entirely. She became one data point in a continuum. Her case remained central not because of uniqueness, but because it was the clearest example of what happens when recognition comes late. Every prevented case reinforced that lesson silently. The absence of spectacle was itself evidence that the model worked. This third phase sets up the final implication. If Annabelle was never the first, and early recognition can prevent escalation, then the most disturbing stories may be the ones that never become stories at all. The final part will explore this implication: how many cases ended quietly before anyone noticed, and why silence, rather than horror, may be the most accurate measure of success. The most unsettling implication of the Annabelle case emerges only after the pattern is fully understood. If she was never the first, and if early recognition can prevent escalation, then the stories that reach public awareness represent only a fraction of what actually occurs. The majority leave no trace. They end quietly, without incident, without documentation that ever becomes narrative. These are not failures of investigation. They are its intended outcome. Silence, in this context, is evidence of success. Investigators came to accept that the most dangerous cases are not those remembered, but those that never had to be remembered at all. When early indicators are recognized and engagement is minimized, the pattern collapses before it can express itself. No escalation means no spectacle. No spectacle means no story. This absence creates a distortion in perception. The public associates danger with visibility. Investigators learn to associate danger with pattern recognition. The two perspectives rarely align. This realization forced a reevaluation of how risk is measured. Traditional metrics rely on incidents. Annabelle demonstrated that incidents are late-stage signals. By the time something dramatic occurs, conditions have already shifted significantly. The true measure of effectiveness became prevention without proof. This demanded trust in models rather than events. Annabelle's case provided the empirical foundation needed to justify that trust internally, even when external validation was impossible. The idea that many cases ended quietly also explained a long-standing discrepancy in historical records. Reports of severe escalation appeared sporadically across decades, with no clear increase or decrease over time. Investigators had once attributed this to randomness. With the Annabelle model, a different explanation emerged. Improved recognition reduced escalation frequency, but not occurrence. The pattern persisted, its expression changed. Silence replaced spectacle. This reframing altered how investigators viewed documentation itself. Not every intervention needed a detailed report. Excessive documentation risked creating narratives that invited reinterpretation. Instead, many cases were logged minimally, focusing on condition management rather than description. These records served operational continuity rather than historical completeness. The goal was not to preserve stories, it was to preserve stability. Annabelle had shown that stories themselves could become vectors of engagement. Another implication concerned misattribution of safety. When nothing happens, it is tempting to assume nothing was wrong. Investigators understood this assumption as hazardous. Absence of incident could indicate correct action taken early, not absence of threat. This distinction mattered deeply. Without it, early interventions could be abandoned as unnecessary. Annabelle's case stood as the counterexample. Something had been wrong, but recognition came late. The cost of that delay had been instructive. This understanding also reshaped how investigators interpreted skepticism. Skeptical dismissal often relied on the argument that most cases lead nowhere. Investigators agreed, but for a different reason. Most cases led nowhere because they were interrupted early. Skepticism misread outcome as evidence of non-existence. Investigators read outcome as evidence of effective restraint. Annabelle bridged this interpretive gap internally, even if it remained invisible externally. The quiet endings of most cases also introduced ethical tension. How much should be disclosed about something that never escalated? Disclosure risks engagement. Non-disclosure risks misunderstanding. Investigators resolved this tension by prioritizing safety over narrative completeness. Annabelle had demonstrated that not all knowledge should circulate freely. Some knowledge functions best when contained, even if that containment appears unsatisfying. This approach inevitably produced an imbalance between public perception and internal reality. Public narratives focused on rare escalations. Internal practice focused on preventing them. Annabelle occupied a unique position because her escalation had been documented thoroughly enough to change practice. She became a cautionary artifact, not a template to replicate, but a mistake not to repeat. The goal was to ensure that future cases never resembled hers closely enough to become instructive again. Over time, investigators accepted that success would remain invisible. There would be no confirmation that a prevented case had truly been dangerous. No counterfactual could be proven. Decisions would always appear conservative in hindsight. Annabelle's case provided the only justification needed to accept that discomfort. It showed what happens when recognition comes too late. That knowledge outweighed the discomfort of acting without proof. The phrase "Annabelle was never the first" thus carries a final sobering meaning. She was not the first because the mechanism did not begin with her, but she may be among the last to be widely known. As recognition improved, escalation diminished, stories disappeared, silence increased. From an investigative standpoint, this was progress. From a narrative standpoint, it was absence. Horror gave way to prevention. This inversion challenges how danger is understood culturally. The most effective interventions do not produce dramatic outcomes. They prevent them. Annabelle's legacy lies not in what she did, but in what no longer needs to happen because of what was learned. Her case marked the transition from reaction to recognition, from storytelling to system management. The final and most uncomfortable conclusion is this: the lack of new Annabelle-like stories is not evidence that the phenomenon ended. It is evidence that it is being recognized earlier and handled differently. The mechanism persists. The response has changed. Investigators do not fear a resurgence of spectacle. They fear loss of recognition. Loss of recognition would return the system to its earlier state, where escalation was the only signal something was wrong. This is why Annabelle remains relevant despite reduced visibility. She represents the cost of late understanding. She stands as a reminder that some patterns only become obvious after damage is done. The objective since her case has been to ensure that understanding arrives sooner, quietly, and without story. In the end, the most accurate measure of success is silence. No headlines, no incidents, no narratives, just stability maintained by restraint. Annabelle was never the first, but she may be one of the last that needed to be seen.